Hi there. In this tutorial I'm going to demonstrate a couple of the techniques I used to create this effect. The first time I did this and the video I uploaded, I did it with Eevee, and in retrospect that was probably a poor choice because of the sort of subject here. So this is it re-rendered in Cycles, and I think the effect is much more obvious. So what I've done is I've created actual texture on those coins, and I'm going to demonstrate how to do that without using lots and lots of geometry, which would cause a problem when you're using this much rigid body physics, or even if you had a lot of particles for that matter. So to begin with, we need to make the normal map, which is what we're going to use to create the apparent texture on our coins, and it'll become obvious what I mean by that as we go along. So to begin with, I'm going to add just a mesh circle, and I'll just add a bit of geometry into it. So I've gone into edit mode, pressed E, clicked scale and scale it in quite a long way, and zoom in, and I'll just fill the center there, and then Control R and fill in a few more vertices, and we're going to need more vertices than this. It's one of those rare occasions where we can actually put as much geometry within reason as we want on here, because this object isn't actually going to be in the final scene that we render. I'm just going to create one coin, but I used the same approach for all of them. So the next thing I'm going to do is add a modifier, which is the displace modifier. And before I go any further, I'm going to actually go into edit mode, select all those vertices, press U and say project from view bounds. We'll probably need to play with the UV map a little bit in a minute anyway, but that's got it UV mapped. I've got some images of some Roman coins, and I'm going to use those to create the texture. You could just model the texture directly, or you can find some other textures if that's what you want. So up here I'm going to click new, and we'll click here. It says image or movie, and I'll say open. In my source images you can see I've got some pairs of coins. I've got some single ones as well, but I'll use a pair and I'll show you how you can use that. So this one's quite interesting. We'll open that one. So at the moment it's not looking too good. Part of the reason for that is because of the way it's mapped, but also because of the strength. So we'll go back to the modifier and we'll turn the strength down a long way. We'll go for 0.1 to start with, so that's a more reasonable. But you can see there's still not enough geometry in there. So I'm going to press Ctrl 2, which will add a subdivision surface, but that's just smoothing out what we've already got. So I need to put it above my texture. Now you can see it's starting to show the detail. I'm going to go for 0.05 strength now, I think. And now we'll go back to our texture. Under mapping, we can select clip, and that basically stops it repeating endlessly. You just get one version of the image. So if I show that again, the default is repeat, and you can see it repeats that way, and we only need clip. But you can see we've just got the edge of those two coins in our map. So I'm going to open up the UV editor, and I'm going to load in that coins image. There's my coin, and you can see the UV map is stretched across both coins. So I'm going to select it all, scale on the X to begin with, and scale it down a little, and then just move it over one of the coin images. Perhaps slightly smaller. You want it slightly inside, and at the moment you can see it hasn't changed, and the reason for that is because we're not using the UV mapping yet. So if we go back to our modifier, under here we can say UV, and just make sure it says UV map, but there you go. You can see our image is starting to show now. Still a bit low res, so what we can do is add more geometry. As I said, we're not too worried about the amount of geometry we're creating. Currently there are 75,000 vertices in this one coin face. We could possibly go even higher than that. That's starting to look quite nice now. Possibly the strength is still a bit too high for a coin. Perhaps we'll go for 0.035. Under sampling, you can also increase the size of the filter, which will smooth it out a bit. So if we go for 10, for example, you can see there's almost nothing left, but I guess that might be a very worn coin. So let's try 4, and that's not too bad. Maybe go even lower than that, 3. So we've got a bit of detail showing up. Now this isn't perfect because I'm not using a proper height mapped image to create this. You could draw one, of course. So you can see on the cheek of this image where it's very bright, we don't actually get a raised area down here. It's mostly creating the outline where there is obviously light shining on it. So these images haven't been created for this effect, but nevertheless it does give you a pretty good impression of a coin. So now I'm going to duplicate that, GZ, just to move it down a little. Because the normals are still pointing upwards, I'm going to press R and rotate on the x-axis 180 degrees. And now let's look at that coin face, and this time we'll go into edit mode again, but we're now going to move that one on the x-axis GX so that it's using the other side of that image. And there it is. So we've got the two sides of the coin, but we now need to make that into some form that's more useful for the animation we're going to create. So at the moment, that's a lot of geometry. We've got we've got over 500,000 vertices in this one coin. So completely impractical for animating any significant number of these coins. But what we can do is render this into what's called a normal map. So a normal map is used to tell the render engine that it should render as if there was geometry that in reality there is not. So here we've got the actual geometry. There are vertices that define where the surface is. But what we could do is use a normal map to render the shading and highlights as if there were geometry there without actually having that geometry. It'll become clearer when I've used it. You need to be in cycles for this, by the way. So make sure you're in cycles. And then come up to here, the view layer properties. And the default is to have combined and Z for rendering. We don't actually need either of those because we're not looking at making a rendered image as such. What we do need though is normal. So I'll just render that at that level once I've positioned the camera. Strictly this should be orthographic as well, but it doesn't matter too much for this purpose. So I'm going to turn the camera to look down and then position it over here. What I did before was render the front and the back of the coin, as it were. I'm just going to take my coin, rotate on the Y 180 after duplicating it, move that into here, make sure there is a gap between them just to make life a bit easier, and move this out. So there you can see our coin. And now I'm just going to render. I'm just rendering at my default of 1080p at the moment. Obviously there's no lighting in the scene, so it's just the grey background. But at the moment all we're seeing is that ray effect. So if we go to the node editor and go to the compositor and say use nodes, you'll notice currently it's connecting the image to our composited output. But I'm going to take the normal and take that out to our output. And now suddenly you can see, if you're familiar with them, that this is now a normal map. Normal maps use colours, red, green and blue, to define whether a part of the geometry should be rendered as if it's coming toward the camera or going off slightly to one side, and so on and so forth. So it's an X, Y and Z direction defined with colours. Now the first thing I'd point out is because I only rendered at 1920 by 1080, it's quite a low res render, and sometimes you want to really see the detail in the geometry. So what I ended up doing was actually put this up to 400%. So if I go to slot 2, we may be able to see a difference. It'll obviously take quite a bit longer to render this time. And strictly, you don't even need to do that many samples, of course, because you're not actually rendering light bounces. All you're rendering is a normal map based on the distance of each pixel. So there we are, a relatively high resolution normal map. And obviously the resolution I used of the image to create this had its limits, and I could have created more geometry to make a finer map. Plus I could have just modelled that, or drawn it, or sculpted it. This is one of the benefits of normal maps. So now all we need to do is save as. Normally I would say a PNG, and you can see I've got a couple of them there. And now we need to create a new file if we want to use these coins. It's taking a while because it's quite a big image. So we'll say new, general, and save the changes. So now we'll just create another circle. We'll put some geometry in it, but it doesn't need very much. It's worth putting a little bit of extra geometry in there because we may want to add some effects to it. Select all the surfaces, E, and then GZ, just to lift it up a little bit. That looks about right. Again, we'll add some loops in the middle with Control R, and then scale Z just to size them up a bit. Just going to take those two edge loops there, scale them in, and then scale on Z slightly just to add a sort of roundness to the edge of the coin. And now if we have a look at that coin, we have currently 256 vertices. That's a big difference from the over 500,000 we had in the other, but of course it doesn't look anything like the other one at the moment. So we'll right click it and say shade smooth, and I'm going to select the two center faces there, Control plus, and just say U project from view. So I haven't unwrapped the edge. Pull down another window and go to the UV editor, and I'm just going to open from my textures the new coin normal map that I created, and there it is. So you can see there are my two coins. So I obviously need to rescale them, so it will scale on the X, bring that in. This is both of them I've got selected at the moment, but once I've got the size right, I can then just move the other one across. Obviously these coins might not in real life have been quite so perfectly round as they are here. So I clicked one vertex there and then Control L, and that lets me select a whole face, basically the connected vertices. So that's mapped it, but obviously I haven't applied it as a texture yet. So we'll go to shader editor, come down to materials and say new, and we'll call this coin 1. So to begin with, I'm just going to add a sort of yellow orange base color. I'm going to turn metallic all the way up, these are quite shiny coins, and roughness down to about there, 0.15, something like that. We go into rendered view, and I'm still in cycles mode, but I've got no lights at the moment. So what I'm going to do is just go to the world, say use nodes, select an environment, and I'll use an HDRI for the environment. You can see the HDRI in the background, but most importantly, it lights the scene in a realistic way, which helps with showing the object, especially metallic and reflective objects. So at the moment it's just an unstamped coin. So now I'm going to add a texture, which is an image texture, and we'll use the texture we just created. Then I'm going to add under vector a normal map node, and I'm going to plug the color output from that one into the color input of the normal map. Quite important that you select non-color down here, otherwise you'll lose some of the data, it won't be so good. We only need clip because we don't need to repeat the texture, and then we can take the normal map output into the normal input here, and suddenly you can see our coin again. We haven't done anything to the edge yet, obviously. So you will then potentially need to play around with the strength. I'm going to make sure we've got the UV map selected, but it defaults to that anyway. And we may need to tweak the edge there because it looks like it's something not quite right there. So there's a very subtle version, and I can obviously strengthen that texture there. So you can see it's quite a worn coin there, and we can increase it there. So now we just need to do something with the edge. I used object space because that seemed to give me slightly more detail, and then you can decide how rough your coin is, so that obviously takes out a lot of the reflections or otherwise. If you get in these little black holes, it may be that the strength is a bit too high. And I'll take that roughness back again so we've got our reflections. You can use some anisotropic if you want it to look as though it's been polished in a particular way, and you might want to darken it quite a bit as well. So then we just need to deal with the edge of the coin. For that I'm going to create a new material based on the coin material, but we'll click this so that it's unique, and we'll say edge. For this one we don't need that texture obviously, and we don't need the normal map. So I'm going to add an input which is texture coordinate, because I haven't unwrapped that. I'm going to add a texture which is a noise texture, and take the object coordinate into the vector of that. I used a scale of about 9.9, maximum detail, although you can go higher by typing it in, and then add under vector a bump node, take the factor out into the height. I set the strength to about 0.29, and then that output goes into the normal. And what we have to do, of course, is apply it. I've already got the faces selected. I'm going to go select, invert, and then assign. And now you can see we've got this bumpy texture all around the edge. and you can change the strength. You can increase or reduce it as you see fit. So you can see we now have a coin with heads and tails. So if I rotate that a bit, there you can see it there. Can be a bit difficult to see very shiny objects quite well. And we've got a bit of a rim there. We could probably extend this material out slightly just to take it slightly further, and it would need UV mapping as well. But essentially that's how we use a normal map in order to create a coin. The next thing we want to do is just create a lot of them. That's obviously just duplicating them. We're not using a particle system here. And then add physics. So I'm just going to add a plane, increase the size of that. And now with physics, it will often work better with a collision plane if you make it actually a box. So I'm going to press E and then G, Z, and just bring it down like that. So we've actually got a flattened box there now. And we'll just say a new material and give it a nice blue color and make it slightly shiny. So let's lift our coin up a bit. And we'll also add an area light, I think. And we'll make that reasonably bright and give it perhaps a slight yellow color. Make that very small, but also very, very bright. So that's sort of a rim light. And we'll make that a cool white. So there we go. There's a bit of noise in it at the moment, but we can deal with that easily enough. So now to add some physics. So I'm just going to very briefly do the physics because this was really about the normal maps. Come into here under physics properties and just say rigid body. If I press play on the timeline now, spacebar, it will just fall, but it fell through that plane down there. So I'm going to select the plane as well and say rigid body on that one as well. But if I now press play, they both fall. And that's because the plane needs to be a passive object. We don't need a full convex hull. This is sort of a more complicated way of assessing whether something is connected with it. So we'll change that to just box, and that will make it a bit simpler. And now when I press play, you can see the coin lands on our surface and then rattles around a bit. So we need to work out what we're going to do in terms of mass and things like that. I used a mass of about 0.015, 1.5 grams, I guess that is. It's using convex hull at the moment. Because it's such a simple shape, we can actually just use cylinder. The simpler this is, the better, because more complex shapes, for example using mesh, will force Blender to do a lot more calculations and introduce more opportunities for errors. Then under surface response, I turned the friction down a little bit, but turned the bounciness up a bit. And we can see what that does. See, it bounces slightly more. If you want the coins to settle eventually, it may be necessary under dynamics to increase damping and the rotation damping slightly. So this slows any movement down over time unless there's another force acting on it. Now obviously there's gravity acting on it at the moment, so off it goes. But once it's stopped falling, this damping translation will stop it moving. And the same for rotation. Unless there's something making it rotate, this will slowly damp the rotation, and then by turning on deactivation, when it falls below this point, it will just stop. So it's useful to use both of these things, because if you don't, you can sometimes get strange effects where it continues to wobble, spin, move, jump up and down indefinitely. And it may do that anyway. Sometimes you need to move things around to get them to use the new values. I used 0.9 of a meter per second for the velocity deactivation, and I used 1 meter per second for rotation. So that's slightly higher than the default. So once you've got your values somewhere near where you want them, let's just go over to the rigid body world settings, which is under here, and open those up. So I set the speed to 0.5 because I thought that would be more interesting. So the gravity force is the same, but now it takes twice as long to do anything. And if necessary, if you're finding coins are passing through each other or passing through the floor, you may need to turn up solver iterations, but only do that if you need to. So this is just how many calculations it does per frame. By turning the speed down, you've effectively turned this up anyway. Going too high can often detect minor problems that weren't a problem at lower iteration rates. So it's worth playing around with them and not just assuming the highest value is the one you need to use and then backing off from that. You're actually better off starting with a low value and just going up until you get somewhere you need to be. We may still find some of the coins go through. So now I'm just going to duplicate this coin. I'm going to give them all sort of some fairly random angles, and then I'm going to select all of them like that, and then again. So depending on how long you want the coins to fall, you are probably going to need quite a lot of coins. And as we can't instantiate physical objects with particle systems, I'm sure you can do it with scripts. This is how we do it. You could of course have a hopper or something like that they all fall into, and then that hopper could be animated to turn over and release them all. So I'll stick with that many at the moment, and let's just see what happens. So you can see they're all falling completely static, but they are colliding with the plate down here and behaving in a reasonably natural manner. So I'm going to turn the end frame up to 500, but under my rigid body world I do need to put the cache up from the default of 250 frames to 500 as well. Otherwise all the animation will just stop. So obviously releasing coins, it's unlikely they would be falling in a completely static way like that, where they're not moving. So you could put a force field up here, but before we go any further, should call them coins really of course, what I'm going to do is select all of these coins, and I'm going to move them to a new collection with M, just call it coins, and that will make selecting them much easier. So I'm going to raise them up a little more, and then I'm going to add a little cube. So we've got a use here for our default cube. I'm going to put some rotation on it. Going to come down to the cube properties, under visibility, I'm going to say show in viewport, but not show in renders, and just make sure by turning all of these off. Though if I've turned off not show in renders, it shouldn't show up anyway. And then I'm going to put another one here, give that a slightly different rotation, and another one here. What I should have done is put the other properties on it that I want first. So I'm going to come to this one, come to the physics setting, physics properties, and then add it to the rigid body world, but obviously as a passive. Now, if I was adjusting settings, the way that I can quickly add it to all of the other objects, so for example if I wanted to change the settings for the coins, is select them all, make sure you may be able to see that we've got a sort of darker orange for all of these, except for this one which has a slightly lighter orange. If I click that one, that one's the darker orange now and that one's the lighter. This is the primary selected object and these are the secondary, as it were. With it like that, if I press F3 and just say copy, you can see one of the options is copy rigid body settings. So if I now click that and then click on one of those, you can see they've all got these settings. Now I've noticed something that I don't need, which is the convex hull. These are just cubes. So let's set that to box, and again select all my cubes, press F3 and say copy rigid body settings, and now they're all set to cubes. So let's see what that does. And you can see the coins are colliding with those cubes, and that's just giving them a bit more random motion. And if I go to rendered view and turn off that, you can see those cubes aren't visible. Come back into this view, but we're getting lots of nice movement on those coins. One last little thing, and that's about the noise that you're going to get when you render these coins. Because they're shiny objects and they've got detailed texture on them, if I render that, we are going to get a fair bit of noise. Now, I tried rendering these in Eevee to begin with, and it wasn't that satisfactory. I possibly could have put more effort into the Eevee render, but Eevee does have its limitations. Cycles gives you a much more realistic render, so these to me look like actually shiny coins. But there is a fair bit of noise on there. It's not too bad actually. What we can do to improve that is under the render settings, make sure we render denoise data. And now we'll need to re-render again. It won't look any different initially. And of course one of the issues is you can get rid of noise to a certain extent by rendering more samples, but of course that takes longer, and then you've got to if you're creating an animation, that adds up with all the different frames that you're creating. So there's our image. As I said, it's not actually too bad. But if I now go to the compositor and say use nodes, you can see we've got these extra options down here. So if I now go to filters and add the denoise filter and drop that in there, I can now take away the denoising normal and the denoising albedo, and that gives us a smoother image. It's a subtle effect on this particular image, but the point is it allows you to render at fewer samples and therefore render more quickly. If I take that off, I just use the straight through. It's a slightly sharper image, but slightly noisy. But as I say, it is a subtle thing, and denoising does take a moment, but it makes it a bit smoother. So I hope you found that useful. If you did, let me know, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot. So I hope you found that interesting. If you did, let me know. If you enjoy these tutorials, don't forget to click like and subscribe. I also have a Facebook page and a Twitter account, and I now have a Patreon page as well, and I'll provide links to all of those in the description below. So I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.